Good day, sir, madam. My name is Botton Fast Check. Today we'll cover the topic the horizontal dimension of categorization. So let's go. Most, if not all, categories do have clear cut boundaries, and to argue that basic object categories follow clusters of perceived attributes is not to say that such attribute clusters are necessarily discontinuous. In terms of the principles of categorization, proposed earlier, cognitive economy dictates that categories tend to be viewed as being as separate from each other and as clear-cut as possible. One way to achieve this is by means of formal, necessary, and sufficient criteria for category membership. The attempt to impose such criteria in categories marks virtual definitions in the tradition of Western reason. The psychological treatment of categories in the standard concept identification paradigm lies within the tradition. Another way to achieve separateness and clarity of actually continuous categories is by conceiving of each category in terms of its clear cases rather than its boundaries. As Wittgenstein has pointed out, categorical judgments become a problem only if one is concerned with boundaries. In the normal course of life, two neighbors know on whose property they are standing without exact demarcation of the boundary line. Category can be viewed in terms of their clear cases if the perceiver places an emphasis on the correlational structure of perceived attributes such that the categories are represented by the most structured portions. By prototypes of categories we have generally meant the clearest cases of prime membership defined operationally by people's judgments of goodness of membership in the category. A great deal of confusion in the discussion of prototypes has risen from two sources. First, the notion of prototypes has tended to become reified as thought as though it meant a specific category member of mental structure. Questions are then asked in an either or fashion about whether something is or is not the prototype or part of the prototype, in exactly the same way in which the question would previously have been asked about the category boundary. Such thinking precisely violates the Wittgensteinian insight that we can judge how clear a case something is and deal with categories on the basis of clear cases in the total absence of information about boundaries. Second, the empirical findings about prototypicality have been confused with theories of processing. That is, there has been a failure to distinguish the structure of categories from theories concerning the issue of the structure in processing. Therefore, let us first attempt to look at prototypes in as purely structural fashion as possible. We will focus on what may be said about prototypes based on operational definitions and empirical findings alone, without the tradition of processing assumptions. Perception of typicality differences is, in the first place, an empirical fact of people's judgments about category membership. It is by now a well-documented finding that subjects overwhelmingly agree in their judgments on how good an example or clear case members are of a category, even for categories about whose boundaries they disagree. Such judgments are reliable even under changes of instructions and items. Were such agreements and reliability in judgment not to have been obtained, there would be no further point in discussion or investigation of the issue. However, given the empirical verification of degree of prototypicality, we can proceed to ask what principles determine which items will be judged the more prototypical and what other variables might be affected by prototypicality. In terms of the basic principles of category formation, the formation of category prototypes should, like basic levels of abstraction, be determinable and be closely related to the initial formation of categories. For categories of concrete objects, which do not have a psychological basis, as categories such as colors and forms apparently do, a reasonable hypothesis is that prototypes develop through the same principles such as maximization of Q-validity and maximization of category resemblance as those principles governing the formation of the categories themselves. In support of such a hypothesis, Russian movies have shown that the more prototypical of a category member is rated, the more attributes it has in common with other members of the category, and the fewer attributes in common with members of the contrasting categories. This finding was demonstrated for natural language superordinate categories, for natural language basic level categories, and for artificial categories in which the definition of attributes and the amount of experience with items was completely specified and controlled. The same basic principles can be represented in ways other than through attributes in common. Because the present theory is a structural theory, one aspect of it is that centrality shares the mathematical notions inherent in measures like the mean and mode. Prototypical category members have been found to represent the means of attributes that have a metric such as size. In short, prototypes appear to be just those members of a category that most reflect the redundancy structure of the category as a whole. That is, if category is formed to maximize the information-rich cluster of attributes in the environment, and thus the q-validity or category resemblance of the attributes of categories, prototype of category appear to form in such a manner as to maximize such clusters and such q-validity still further within categories. It is important to note that for natural language categories, both at the superordinate and basic levels, the extent to which items have attributes common to the category was highly negatively correlated with the extent to which they have attributes belonging to members of contrast categories. This appears to be part of the structure of real-world categories. It may be that such structure is given by the correlated clusters of attributes of the real world, or such structure may be a result of the human tendency once contrast exists to define attributes for contrasting categories, so that the categories will be maximally distinctive. In either case, it is a fact that both representativeness within a category and distinctiveness from contrast categories are correlated with prototypicality in real categories. For artificial categories, either principle alone will produce prototype effects depending on the structure of the stimulus set. Thus, to perform experiments to try to distinguish which principle is the one that determines prototype formation and category processing appears to be an artificial exercise. That's all for now. Thank you for your attention. Subscribe and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.